Adopted children killed their mom and attended her funeral with her car. The church was silent until the doors burst open. Two grown children dressed in black arrived in the same car their mother once drove to Sunday service, the car she was found dead inside. Neighbors whispered such devotion, but behind those tears hid something darker, because minutes later, the woman they buried was about to walk in and reveal who truly died that day. Before we go any further, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Now, let's begin. Grace Hightower had hands that remembered every lunchbox she packed and every fever she cooled. Even when the house felt too quiet for a woman who had raised noise like a garden, Lucas left sneakers by the door. Emily lined up candles on the sill. Their traces softened her age. Neighbors waved, then whispered when they thought her back was turned. That car in the driveway, hers bought it. The words hung in the sun. She moved through mornings with careful grace. Tea kettle hiss, citrus peel curling, the soft thud of mail. The air smelled of lemon oil and old hymnals. Some days her hip flared, a heat she hid with a smile. She had poured years into two children no one else took home, stitching their lives to hers with small rituals, unglamorous and steady. Pressure arrived quiet forms on the counter just to help with bills. A nudge about power of attorney, pure routine. Their voices were bright, but the brightness felt brittle like glass held too tightly. Grace noticed how Lucas checked her pillbox, how Emily rehearsed kindness like a script. The house began to hum with a new rhythm. Off by a beat she could not unhear. At church, an usher muttered, "Kids grow different when money sits on the table." She brushed it off because love, once given, resists suspicion. Still, at night, she lay awake and counted the seconds between refrigerator clicks. Measuring fear like sailors measure fog, she tested the edges. She let the bank statements sit unopened just to see who asked. She switched where she kept her keys. She watched Lucas flinch when she mentioned adding the soup kitchen to her will. She watched Emily gather the mail early, then pretend she hadn't. Microtells, tiny drifts. One afternoon, a sweet chemical note slid under the kitchen door, almost floral, almost burned. The kettle hadn't boiled. The oven was cold. Grace paused, then raised a window to the thin winter sun. Outside, wind moved the last brown leaves like flags. Across the street, two teenagers argued about a foul shot. Life went on noisy and normal, which made the oddness sharper. That night, she wrote a list on an index card. Patterns, anomalies, questions. She folded it into her pocket and felt its square comfort against her palm. If she was wrong, she could laugh at herself. If she was right, she would not be alone. A decision gathered like weather offshore, unseen, but inevitable. She saved a number under a harmless name and slept. Not easier, but ready for keeps, right? She met Rowan Miles in a cafe that smelled like burnt caramel and fresh paint. He listened while Grace laid out the forms, the chemical note in her kitchen, the new rhythm in her house. Rowan worked in circles, pharmacy logs, garbage pickups, credit pulls, a storage unit near the river, paid in cash. She gave him her calendar and her calm. At home, she moved softer and kept her real medication in a robe pocket. Micro precautions easy to miss. The block had its chorus by the mailbox. A dog walker muttered that kids wanted shortcuts. At the salon, someone that Grace was too generous. Lucas showered at odd hours, music low, water roaring too long. Emily lingered by the sink, scrolling with a restless thumb. An unknown number flickered on both their phones after midnight. Lucas locked his car with a double tap and watched the porch light cut his face. He looked like a boy testing a grown trick. Rowan's notes tightened. Lab Glacier ordered online. Searches for tasteless toxins in tea. A payday lender receipt. Debt like teeth. The picture was not loud. Developed like film until intent stood there. Grace rehearsed at night. She practiced a stagger that would not break a hip. She timed her breath for a fainting spell that felt real, but safe. She laughed once, then covered her mouth. In the mirror, her eyes looked younger than the ache. Fear would not write the ending. One evening, the kettle sang. She set out 3 cups, then swapped hers for the duplicate Rowan had given her. A twin mug with a hidden strip that changed color if something ugly kissed the rim. The strip stayed pale. Later, she found another mug rinsed to clean. The rim held a ghost of almond and something colder. Rowan introduced Dr. Celeste Ward, a hospitalist with careful hands. They met in an office that hummed. Celeste did not promise spectacle. She promised control. A harmless agent would mimic organ distress. Paramedics would arrive on cue, records sealed by protocol, obituary lines spare and dignified. Rowan in the back row. Grace absent and also present. Grace kept the house normal. She asked the kids to help plan a spring yard sale. She circled catalog items and joked about ugly shoes. She left room for redemption without wagering her life. She remembered Lucas at 6 asleep on a bus. She remembered Emily choosing a library card. Love does not turn off. It learns to stand back.
As the plan built itself.
Timing dosage witnesses. A church friend for pageantry. A neighbor who could cry on cue. A funeral director who owed Ward. No flourishes, just rails to keep a scene on the curve. Rain started the night before the test run. The house smelled of lemon oil and wet wool. Down the hall, a phone lit the ceiling. Grace lay still, counting to 100, then 2. Traffic hissed. The refrigerator clicked and settled. She pressed her palm to the index card in her pocket and felt its small square. She exhaled, steadying her hands. Okay, tomorrow had a shape necessary. The next morning dawned silver and slow light dripping through the lace curtains like milk. Grace sat at the kitchen table, a robe around her shoulders, steam rising from her cup. Lucas and Emily appeared, both too polite, both too ready. Their eyes darted to the mug, to her hands, to each other. Grace smiled faintly, stirring the tea with a small spoon until it rang against the porcelain. She lifted it halfway, paused, and asked about their day. Emily's voice cracked first. Lucas forced a chuckle that didn't land. Grace took one long sip, barely touching her lips to the liquid. The bitter trace brushed her tongue, metallic and sweet. She set the cup down carefully, eyes soft. 10 minutes later, she let her breath shorten. The tremor came next, practiced but convincing. Her chair scraped, porcelain shattered on tile. Emily screamed. Lucas froze, and the room filled with frantic noise. They did what guilty people do. They overacted. Lucas called 911 too quickly, reading lines from memory. When the sirens arrived, Dr. Ward's disguised paramedics moved with quiet precision, carrying Grace into the ambulance while Lucas hovered near the door, face pale with confusion, fear, and something like relief. By afternoon, news spread. Poor Miss Hightower, the mailman whispered, did everything for those kids. The block swelled with gossip that tasted like dust. People brought flowers, plastic casseroles, and polite disbelief. At the hospital, Ward declared cardiac arrest. Papers signed, witnesses nodded. The body transferred discreetly to the crematory morgue. Rowan handled the background, falsified certificates, the burial arrangements, the timing for what came next. Grace lay still for 2 days in the safe wing, her body hidden under a different name. Machines hummed quietly around her, measuring nothing. She watched the clock until the minute hand became a lullaby. Sleep came easy when you were supposed to be dead. Meanwhile, Lucas and Emily wasted no time. They withdrew savings, posted listings for her furniture, and drove her sedan to a detailer, laughing nervously about keeping Mom's memory alive. Rowan's team tracked every step, each credit swipe another nail. The funeral date arrived on a windless morning. Grace was dressed by the hospital staff. A beige scarf around her head, her skin powdered to mimic stillness. Ward adjusted the lighting in the chapel. Cameras hidden inside floral wreaths blinked red and ready. At 11 sharp, Lucas and Emily arrived in Grace's car, polished and smelling of cheap pine spray. Emily wore black like a costume. Lucas greeted guests with fake humility. One hand in his pocket, another on the offering bowl. Their friends from college whispered about how kind they were to care for an old woman. Inside the casket, Grace lay waiting. The scent of lily clawed the air. She heard every word, every whispered lie about her last will, every sympathetic pat they received. And as the organ began to play, her heartbeat slowed, but her resolve hardened. The moment was near, and this time, justice would rise on cue. The chapel glowed with quiet grief. Candles lined the aisle, their flames trembling like secrets. Guests filled the pews, murmuring stories about the woman who had raised two angels. Outside, rain clung to the windows, streaking the glass like tears. Lucas stood near the pulpit, voice breaking at practiced intervals. "Our mother was selfless," he said, pressing a folded paper to his chest. Emily dabbed at her eyes. The picture of sorrow, but her phone buzzed in her palm, a reminder from the attorney about property transfers scheduled for the next morning. Rowan watched from the back pew, coat collar turned up, expression unreadable. The officer beside him nodded once, hand resting near his badge. When the pastor motioned for the final viewing, Emily stepped forward first. She leaned over the casket, lips trembling, whispering words she didn't believe. Lucas followed, clearing his throat, placing a single rose on Grace's folded hands. The air carried a faint scent of disinfectant and lilies. Then came a sound, soft but unmistakable, slow, deliberate inhale. The rose quivered. Grace's fingers twitched. A murmur rippled through the front row, faint at first, then louder as eyes widened. Lucas froze. Emily's face drained to chalk. Grace sat up. Gasps cracked the silence. The organist stopped mid-note. Every head turned as she pulled the scarf from her hair and looked straight at her children. "You should have picked better flowers," she said, voice steady, alive, and cold. Emily stumbled backward, hands shaking. Lucas's mouth opened, but no sound came. Cameras hidden in the wreaths blinked quietly.
Up.
Officers stepped forward from the crowd. Rowan stood now, coat unbuttoned, badge glinting under the chapel lights. Grace stood too, her movements calm, deliberate. She looked older, stronger, as though dying had peeled away the last of her fear. "I raised you from nothing," she said, "and you tried to bury the only person who ever truly loved you." The pastor whispered a prayer under his breath. Bystanders whispered louder. "Poison her kids? Lord of mercy, Emily?" Cried that it was a misunderstanding. Lucas swore it was an accident, but the vial found in his pocket and the texts projected on the chapel wall said otherwise. Officers moved in. Handcuffs clicked like punctuation. Emily sobbed, mascara bleeding down her cheek. Lucas shouted her name until the sound turned hollow. Grace didn't flinch. She only turned toward Rowan and nodded. As they led the siblings away, the crowd parted, their sympathy dissolving into gossip. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air sharp and clean. Grace stepped through the doors, the wind tugging at her scarf, her steps slow but sure. Behind her, the chapel door shut with a heavy echo, an ending that sounded almost like peace. Weeks later, the house smelled of cedar and fresh paint. Sunlight touched the empty rooms like a blessing, tracing over the worn photographs that Grace had chosen to keep. She walked slowly, cane in hand, each step echoing the quiet she'd earned. The neighbors waved again, but this time their whispers carried respect instead of pity. The inheritance papers sat unopened on her table. Instead, she signed another document, one bearing a new name, the Hightower Home for Lost Children. The funds that once tempted betrayal now flowed into walls that would shelter kindness. A playground blueprint lay beside the deed. Laughter, not greed, would fill her final years. Porters tried to reach her for comment. She never answered. She baked bread for the builders and planted a lemon tree behind the porch, its scent climbing into open windows. On Sunday mornings, she could still hear the church bells. It's not as warnings anymore, but as reminders that survival could sound gentle. Rowan visited once, leaving a newspaper folded to the court verdict. Grace didn't read it. "Justice," she said quietly, "doesn't always need noise." That night, she sat on her porch as twilight pressed soft against the street. Fireflies blinked like tiny confessions. She thought of Lucas and Emily, of the small hands that once reached for hers, and felt ache that was grief and gratitude at once. Some stories ended in ruin. Hers ended in rebuilding. She looked up, eyes catching the first star, and whispered, "Let them find what love really means." Then she closed her eyes, the night warm around her, her legacy secure, not in bloodlines, but in the countless small hearts her home would save. If this story moved you, remember kindness is never weakness, and betrayal never wins for long. Share this video to remind others that true family is built on love, not blood or greed. And if you believe justice has its own timing, hit subscribe because more untold stories like this one are